Hello and welcome back to Death and Beyond. Today, part 9. And today we're talking about the exciting and fascinating question if there's another, possibly more plausible description of how the brain functions than just that the physical brain produces our consciousness and all the contents of our consciousness and our personality. Now, why should we question this theory? And why is it not always plausible? If you have followed this series up to here and have taken in the last 8 episodes, you will remember that we have looked at a couple of phenomena that are quite at odds with the theory that the physical brain produces consciousness. First off, we looked at near-death experiences and how people whose brains didn't get enough oxygen to have higher functions, or where no brain activity could be measured anymore, that people who had such conditions and situations still had very complex experiences and even sometimes got information that wasn't present in their system as far as we can tell, and also not in their physical reach because it was at another place, for example. We have also talked about deathbed visions where people who were dying and sometimes the bystanders too had visions of something from a different layer of reality or level of reality, let's say, and also sometimes got information that they couldn't possibly have known otherwise, like, for example, someone who died just half an hour or an hour ago. We've also talked about situations and cases where people had severe brain damage and weren't able to remember things, weren't able to communicate properly or at all, seemed to be unable to perceive anything. And then for a fraction of time, for a short period, suddenly were able to come back to clear consciousness, to clearly communicate, to remember their memories, and sometimes even remember the time when they seemingly weren't able to perceive anything because they couldn't communicate it. There are also cases of people who have very specific talents, savants, and people who essentially can or seem to be able to access information that is not available in their physical reality to them. There's one interesting example, and that's from the book of Michael Nahm, and that's When the Darkness Ends. I've mentioned that before, and he has gone through a whole load of cases and phenomena and things to figure out what that means for our idea of how consciousness and the brain are related. And one of these examples was the case of autistic twins who seem to have been able to read books without reading them. So they essentially could take a book into their hand and give it back and then know the content without physically having read it. So that's also a quite interesting thing. He also talks about people with hydrocephalus who essentially have a very small amount of brain, and it's mainly the structures that are connected to base functions, and the rest of their head is filled with fluid, but some of them still are able to live a normal life, have an average or above average IQ. Even one case where it was really way above average, the IQ of the person. So they can function, and they can do that with a brain that weighs maybe 50 to 150 gram, while a normal brain weighs 1.5 kilograms. So that's quite interesting, quite huge difference. And the question is if the brain produces all the higher faculties, consciousness, contents of consciousness, stores memories and all that, then how can someone with that kind of a brain even function? So all these cases, all these phenomena are rather hard to explain if we assume that the physical brain is producing consciousness and all the contents of consciousness, the higher functions and intellectual functions and all that. It just doesn't really work well. But I'm not the only person who wondered how then can we imagine how that may function? Is there another option to make sense of that? And Michael Nahm obviously had this question too, and he has a chapter, or rather a sub-chapter, where he introduces an idea that was present already in the 19th century, which was suggested by philosophers and psychologists, and that's the idea that the brain may just function as a filter. They used the image of a prism, but we can, just for convenience, imagine a television set or a computer which is connected to the internet. In any case, you have a program running or several programs, and the device receives them and displays them to the viewer. And if the device now, for example, the TV set, has an issue, is somewhat damaged, then there can be certain things that are not transmitted properly. Like you can have issues with the picture, or if you issues with the sound, or no picture, only sound, or no sound, only picture, or if it's really damaged, nothing at all. But that doesn't mean that the program isn't running anymore. It just means the device is damaged. And that could be the case with a brain that works as a filter. So the filter essentially would then take up input from the senses, perceptions, and input from the consciousness, which would be independent of the brain as a filter in its existence, but would be filtered through the brain to then be transported in communication or actions by the person. And that would mean that you can't explain everything, and it's not, it's not proven, it's also a theory, but we have to note that the idea that the physical brain produces consciousness and the contents of consciousness is also not proven, because what we have is we can measure activity in the brain and content of consciousness that happens at the same time or with a slight delay, as far as we can measure that correctly at the moment. But that's just a correlation. That means it's there at the same time or almost the same time, but we don't know what the connection between it is. There probably is a connection, but we don't really know what nature that is. But we usually tend to assume it's a causal connection. So the activity in the brain produces the content of consciousness. And that's not proven. That's just an idea, just a theory. Just like the filter theory. And now the interesting thing and the reason why this filter idea is so appealing is that it can account for pretty much everything that the other theory of the physical brain producing consciousness can explain too. So it can account for that, it can explain all that, but it also can explain a bit more, or has more space for all those cases that are at odds with the brain produces consciousness theory, as we have seen. Now, it doesn't exactly explain why, when the filter is damaged, that in some cases functions are still working, or especially in people where the functions didn't work, they couldn't communicate, and they couldn't move, and they couldn't remember things, they couldn't do the things they usually would be able to do with their undamaged brain and could do before the brain was damaged. So now they can't, and then suddenly for a fraction of time they can again. That's not really explained by this filter theory, but at least the fact that this is possible is not excluded by the filter theory, because the filter theory says that consciousness is independent of the brain. So the question is not, is the consciousness still there? And the memories, content of consciousness, is it still there? The question is, can it express itself through the, damaged filter? It would also account for phenomena where information is gained. When, for example, the filter just works differently, it could be more open and not filter out as much, because the filter function obviously would filter out information that may make it harder for us to function as human beings in a physical body. But for some people, the filter might work differently, and then they can take in information from the stream of consciousness, which you usually can't take in because your brain properly filters it out. Like with these twins that didn't have to read the book, but knew the content of the book afterwards. That's something that would work with the filter theory. And also something very interesting that Michael Nahm mentions in his book is that it seems that when the brain gets damaged, mostly what is affected first and foremost is the ability to communicate, the ability to take physical action, and the ability to perceive things correctly from the outside world. Whilst the higher functions and the consciousness as such, the person as such, still remains intact, and also the memories remain intact. So it could be, so that's what these cases are pointing to. And so it could be that the brain as a filter mainly enables people to perceive things, to communicate, and to move, to take action. So that's quite interesting, and I was really fascinated and happy about finding this idea, because it works a little bit better than the traditional one that's currently the dominant narrative. But I didn't stop there. And next on, at this point I was pretty convinced that we are more than our physical bodies and brains and all that. We are not produced by that. There's something in us, the core element of us, that is independent of that. I was pretty convinced of that when I reached the end of this book. But I went a step further. At the end, you need your personal experience, and we will get there, where I'll explain and tell you about my personal experiences when I got there. But first I needed to get past my intellectual skepticism enough to even let experiences in. And the next thing I went to was very uncomfortable for me. It's still not comfortable. I'm still not comfortable with it. It's definitely not something I wanted to be true. And it was even more uncomfortable back then. And that's the topic of reincarnation. So I think that's where we are going next in our next episode. Hope to see you then. Hope you will listen in and have a good time until then, and bye for now.